For 4 million enslaved people in the American South, this was not imagination. It was reality. Between 1863 and 1865, the institution that had defined their existence, that had defined American society for over 2 centuries, came crashing down. And in that moment of liberation, 4 million human beings had to figure out what freedom actually meant. The stories of how enslaved people learned they were free are as varied as the people themselves. Some learned from Union soldiers marching onto plantations. Some learned from enslavers who gathered them together to deliver the news. Some learned from whispered rumors that traveled faster than any army. Some didn't learn for months, or even years after the war ended. Their reactions were equally varied. Some wept, some shouted, some fell to their knees in prayer. Some walked off the plantation that same hour. Some stayed, uncertain what else to do. Some went searching for family members sold away years before. Some demanded wages for work they had already performed. Some simply stood in silence, trying to comprehend a world that had suddenly irrevocably changed. In this video, we're going to explore these moments of liberation, what historians call the Jubilee. We'll hear the voices of people who experienced freedom for the first time, preserved in interviews, memoirs, and letters. We'll examine what freedom meant in practice for people who had never known it. And we'll confront the complicated reality that liberation was not a single moment, but a process, one that brought joy and sorrow, hope and disappointment, triumph and tragedy. These are the stories of what happened when enslaved people learned they were free. The many moments of freedom. There was no single Emancipation Day. Freedom came to enslaved people at different times, in different ways, depending on where they lived and the fortunes of war. For some, freedom came early. When Union forces captured territory in the South, enslaved people in those areas were effectively liberated, though their legal status remained uncertain until the Emancipation Proclamation took effect on the 1st of January, 1863. In places like coastal South Carolina, New Orleans, and parts of Tennessee, enslaved people tasted freedom while the war still raged. The Emancipation Proclamation itself freed enslaved people only in Confederate held territory, precisely the places where the Union had no power to enforce it. In border states that remained loyal to the Union, such as Kentucky and Maryland, slavery continued legally until the 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865. For the majority of enslaved people in the Deep South, freedom came with the Union Army. As federal forces advanced through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Carolinas in 1864 and 1864, they brought liberation with them. Enslaved people would see blue uniformed soldiers appear on the horizon and know that their world was about to change. And then there was Texas. Texas was the most remote Confederate state, largely untouched by Union military operations. Until the very end of the war, news traveled slowly. Even after Lee surrendered at Appomattox on the 9th of April, 1865, enslaved people in Texas remained in bondage for 2 more months. On the 19th of June, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and issued General Order No. 3, announcing that all enslaved people in Texas were free. This date, Juneteenth, has become the most celebrated commemoration of emancipation, precisely because it represents the moment when the last enslaved people in the continental United States learned of their liberation. But even Juneteenth was not truly the end. Some enslavers in remote areas of Texas concealed the news from their enslaved workers, keeping them in bondage through another harvest season. Individual stories of enslaved people not learning of their freedom until months after the war ended are documented throughout the former Confederacy. Freedom did not arrive on a single day. It arrived in waves, spreading unevenly across the South, reaching some people years before others. The moment itself, Voices from the Jubilee, the Federal Writers' Project of the 1930s, interviewed thousands of formerly enslaved people, recording their memories of slavery and emancipation. These interviews, conducted when the subjects were elderly, provide invaluable first-hand accounts of what liberation felt like. The emotions they describe are overwhelming in their intensity. Fanny Berry of Virginia remembered the day freedom came. Never was no time like 'em befo or since. Niggers shoutin' and clappin' hands and singin', chillin' runnin' all over the place, beatin' tins and yellin', everybody happy. The religious dimension of liberation appears again and again in these accounts. For people who had sustained themselves through bondage with faith in a delivering God, emancipation was the fulfillment of biblical promise. They compared themselves to the Israelites escaping Egypt, finally reaching the promised land after generations of bondage. Tempe Cummins of Texas recalled, "We was all praying to God for this very thing. He done heard our prayers, we knowed he would." But not all reactions were joyful. Some newly freed people were overwhelmed by uncertainty. Freedom was an abstraction they had dreamed of, but the reality was terrifying. Where would they live? What would they eat? How would they survive? Patsy Mitchner of North Carolina remembered the fear. "We didn't know what to do. We were scared. We didn't have nowhere to go, nothing to eat. Some of us just sat down and cried." Children, who had known nothing but slavery, sometimes struggled to understand what was happening. Parents had to explain that the world they had known no longer existed, that they were no longer property, that they could not be sold, that they belonged to themselves. Some enslavers delivered the news themselves, gathering the people they had held in bondage, and announcing that they were free. These scenes varied enormously depending on the character of the enslaver. Some spoke with bitterness and resentment. Some affected kindness, while trying to convince formerly enslaved people to stay and work. A few seemed to have experienced genuine emotion. Felix Haywood of Texas remembered his enslaver's announcement. "The end of the war, it come just as like that. Like you snap your fingers." Hallelujah broke out. Soldiers all of a sudden was everywhere, lots of them. Everybody went wild. "We felt like heroes and nobody had made us that way, but ourselves." Other enslavers refused to inform the people they held. Union soldiers arriving at plantations sometimes found enslaved people who had no idea the war was over, still laboring under the lash, while their supposed owners pretended nothing had changed. When these deceptions were discovered, the reactions were intense. People who learned they had been held illegally for months after emancipation felt a particular outrage. The final crime added to a lifetime of crimes. The first acts of freedom. What did people do when they learned they were free? The answers reveal what bondage had denied them. Many walked off the plantation immediately, not because they had anywhere particular to go, but simply because they could. For the first time in their lives, they could decide where to put their feet. They could walk down a road without a pass, without permission, without fear of the patrol. The simple act of movement of going somewhere because you chose to go there was itself an assertion of humanity. Decades later, formerly enslaved people remembered these walks vividly. They remembered the feel of the road beneath their feet, the strange sensation of walking without looking over their shoulder. Some walked for miles before stopping, just to prove to themselves that they could. Many immediately began searching for family members. Slavery had torn families apart through sale, separating husbands from wives, parents from children, siblings from each other. Now at last, people could search for their lost loved ones. This search would consume years for many people. They walked from plantation to plantation, asking if anyone knew their relatives. They placed advertisements in newspapers. They asked anyone they met. Some traveled hundreds of miles following rumors that proved false. Some never found the people they were looking for. But some did. The reunions, when they occurred, were scenes of almost unbearable emotion. People who had been separated for decades, who had given up hope of ever seeing each other again, suddenly face to face. Parents meeting children who had grown to adulthood. Spouses reuniting after years of forced separation. These reunions also brought pain. People had changed. Children didn't remember parents who had been sold away when they were young. Some people had formed new families, creating complicated situations when original spouses reappeared. The years of separation could not simply be erased. Many people changed their names. Under slavery, they had been given names by enslavers. often deliberately demeaning names, and they had been denied surnames entirely, or forced to carry the surname of the person who claimed to own them. Now they could choose their own names. Some took surnames of their own selection: Freeman, Justice, Liberty, or names that reflected their own family histories, rather than their enslavers. Some took entirely new first names. The act of naming yourself, of claiming an identity that you had chosen, was a profound assertion of personhood. People formalized marriages. Enslaved people had formed families and committed to partners, but these relationships had no legal standing. Enslavers could separate couples at will, and often did. Now couples lined up to have their unions legally recognized, to secure the rights that marriage conveyed. The Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress to aid formerly enslaved people, performed thousands of marriages in the months after emancipation. Couples who had been together for decades, who had raised children together, finally had their relationships acknowledged by law. And many people demanded compensation. They knew that they had worked for years without pay, that their labor had enriched others while they received nothing. Some confronted their former enslavers directly, demanding wages for work performed. Most received nothing, but the demand itself was significant, an assertion that their labor had value, that they were owed something for what had been taken. The reality of freedom, the joy of liberation, was real, but so were the challenges that followed. Freedom did not come with resources. 4 million people were liberated with nothing: no land, no money, no tools, no homes. The economic system they had been forced to build had enriched others while leaving them destitute. Now they had to survive in a world that had systematically denied them everything. The promise of 40 acres and a mule. Land redistribution that would give formerly enslaved people an economic foundation was never fulfilled. Some land was distributed during the war, particularly in the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia. But after Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson reversed these policies, returning land to former enslavers and leaving freed people with nothing. Without land, most formerly enslaved people had few options. Many ended up working for their former enslavers as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, trapped in a cycle of debt that resembled slavery in everything but name. They were technically free, but economic necessity bound them to the same plantations, the same labor, the same subordination. Violence followed freedom. White Southerners who refused to accept emancipation turned to terrorism. The Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations murdered, tortured, and intimidated black people who asserted their rights. The years after emancipation saw thousands of killings, people murdered for voting, for demanding wages, for simply acting as though they were free. Education became a priority. Enslaved people had been systematically denied literacy in most Southern states. Teaching an enslaved person to read was a crime. Now freed people of all ages flooded into schools, established by the Freedmen's Bureau and Northern missionary societies. Elderly people sat beside children, learning to read for the first time. This hunger for education reflected a profound understanding of what freedom required. Reading meant access to information, to contracts, to the law. It meant the ability to participate fully in society. Formerly enslaved people built schools with their own hands and their own money, sacrificing to give their children opportunities they had never had. Juneteenth, the celebration endures of all the dates associated with emancipation. Juneteenth has emerged as the predominant celebration. This is somewhat ironic. The 19th of June, 1865, was not the first day of freedom, but one of the last. The date when news finally reached the most remote enslaved population. But perhaps that is why it resonates. Juneteenth represents completion. It marks the moment when the last people still held in bondage learned the truth. It commemorates not the beginning of freedom, but its fulfillment. Juneteenth celebrations began in Texas in 1866, just 1 year after emancipation. Freed people gathered to commemorate their liberation with food, music, prayer, and community. The celebration spread throughout the African American community, maintained even during the darkest years of Jim Crow when public commemoration could be dangerous. For over a century, Juneteenth was primarily an African American observance, little known to white Americans, but its significance has grown over time. In 2021, Juneteenth became a federal holiday, officially recognized as a day of national commemoration. The growing recognition of Juneteenth reflects a broader reckoning with the history of slavery and emancipation. For too long, that history was marginalized, treated as a regional matter rather than a national one. The elevation of Juneteenth acknowledges that emancipation was one of the most important events in American history, and that its meaning is still being worked out today. The meaning of freedom. What did freedom mean to people who had never known it? The testimonies of formerly enslaved people suggest that freedom meant, above all, self-possession. It meant owning yourself, your body, your time, your labor, your family. It meant the right to make decisions, to go where you chose, to work for your own benefit, to keep your children beside you. Freedom did not mean the absence of hardship. Freed people faced poverty, violence, discrimination, and exploitation. Many lived in conditions that differed little from slavery in material terms. The promise of emancipation was never fully redeemed. But freedom meant something that material conditions could not measure. It meant dignity. It meant humanity recognized. It meant the end of being property and the beginning of being a person in the eyes of the law. Charlotte Brown, interviewed in the 1930s, captured this meaning simply. In slavery time, we belonged to people. They could do with us what they pleased. After freedom, we belonged to ourselves. That belonging, that self-possession, was what enslaved people had dreamed of, prayed for, fought for. When freedom came, it came imperfectly, incompletely, surrounded by dangers and difficulties. But it came, and nothing that followed could erase the significance of that transformation. Conclusion: what happened when enslaved people learned they were free? They wept and shouted and prayed. They walked off plantations just to feel the road beneath their feet. They searched for family members torn from them years before. They chose new names, married partners they had loved for decades, demanded wages for stolen labor. They built schools and churches and communities. They faced violence and poverty and betrayal. They persisted. The moment of emancipation was not an ending but a beginning. The work of freedom, of making liberation real, of securing its promises, of building lives of dignity and opportunity, would take generations. In many ways it continues still, but the Jubilee was real. 4 million people passed from bondage to freedom, and nothing in American history compares to that transformation. Their joy, their tears, their courage, their struggle. All of it deserves to be remembered. When we celebrate Juneteenth, when we teach this history, when we remember these stories, we honor people who refused to accept that they were property. They knew they were human beings. They knew they deserved freedom. And when freedom finally came, they seized it with both hands. Their story is America's story. It is a story of injustice and resilience, of cruelty and courage, of promises broken and promises kept. It is not finished yet.